On the shore of Lake Superior in Duluth, Minnesota, stands a mansion that looks like it was plucked from another century. 39 rooms, grand staircases, marble fireplaces, a home built to be admired, protected, and passed down through generations. But for Minnesotans, when you hear the name Glensheen, you don't think of beauty. You think of blood on a staircase. You think of betrayal. You think of a summer morning in 1977 that turned one of the state's most famous homes into a crime scene. This is the story of the Congdon Mansion murders, better known as the Glensheen murders. Glensheen wasn't just another house, it was a statement. In the early 1900s, Chester Congdon, a mining tycoon who made his fortune in Minnesota's booming iron industry, decided he needed something that would leave a mark. He wanted a legacy carved into stone. So he built a sprawling 39-room mansion on the rocky shoreline of Lake Superior, a place that would make sure the Congdon name sat firmly among Minnesota's wealthy elite long after he was gone. Chester had 8 children. By 1977, only one was left. His youngest daughter, Elizabeth, now frail and nearly 83 years old. She had grown up inside Glensheen, the mansion her father built as both a family home and a monument to his wealth. Being the baby of the family and Chester's favorite meant she carried a special place in his heart. He was a mining tycoon, a lawyer, even a politician, but when it came to Elizabeth, he softened. Her youth was shaped by privilege, but she wasn't idle. She was well educated, lively, and independent. While her older siblings went on to marriages and lives elsewhere, Elizabeth stayed in Duluth and tied to Glensheen. When Chester died in 1916, his empire was divided, but Elizabeth's inheritance was substantial. Over the years, as siblings passed away, she inherited even more. By the time she reached her later years, she was one of the wealthiest women in Minnesota. But Elizabeth didn't use her fortune to live lavishly. Instead, she poured it into causes she cared about: hospitals, churches, schools, charities. Her generosity stretched across the state. To Duluth, she wasn't just the last Congdon living in Glensheen. She was the keeper of her father's legacy. And yet, that very legacy, the fortune Chester left behind to protect his family, would one day put Elizabeth in unimaginable danger. Elizabeth never married. Maybe it was a choice, maybe circumstance. But unlike her siblings, she never had children of her own. Instead, she adopted 2 little girls and raised them as her own. On paper, it was the perfect solution. Her father's legacy would live on through them. Elizabeth's 2 daughters could not have been more different. Jennifer, the eldest, lived a quiet life. She stayed out of trouble, avoided the spotlight, and rarely gave her mother reasons to worry. She wasn't chasing after wealth or recognition. She seemed content with ordinary stability. In a family tied to one of the grandest mansions in Minnesota, Jennifer chose something simpler. Because of that, history doesn't say much about her. She didn't leave behind headlines or scandals. She simply lived. Marjorie was the opposite. Where Jennifer was steady, Marjorie was restless. She had a presence that filled a room, a smile that made you think she was trustworthy, even charming. But the closer you got, the more you realized that charm often hid recklessness. Marjorie wanted a big life, the kind of life that fit the Congdon name. She wanted houses, cars, fine clothes, and attention. But the money wasn't there to sustain it. Again and again, she tried to live above her means, and again, it all came crashing down. By the 1970s, Marjorie's trail was littered with bad checks, unpaid debts, and foreclosures. Banks repossessed her homes. Creditors chased her down. Yet somehow she always managed to move on to the next scheme, the next promise, the next fresh start. People who crossed paths with her often walked away burned, their trust misplaced. Marjorie's life was already turbulent on its own. Failed ventures, financial wreckage, relationships that seemed to collapse as soon as they started. But in the mid 1970s, she found someone who didn't calm the storm. He joined it. Her second husband, Roger Caldwell. Roger Caldwell wasn't born into money. He didn't have a famous family name or a mansion on the lake. What he did have was ambition, the kind that can push someone forward or eat them alive. On the surface, Roger was the kind of man people might trust at first. He was decent looking, carried himself with confidence, and could talk his way through a room. But underneath, he had a restless streak. He wasn't patient, he wasn't steady, he wanted the rewards without the grind it usually takes to earn them. Roger bounced from job to job, chasing opportunities that never seemed to last. He had a temper too, the kind that could flare quickly, especially when things didn't go his way. And more often than not, things didn't. By the time he crossed paths with Marjorie, his life was already full of frustrations, half-baked plans, and a desire to be someone bigger than he was. Marjorie recognized something in Roger. Maybe it was his hunger, maybe it was the way he didn't question her chaos but seemed to thrive in it, where most people eventually grew weary of her drama. Roger leaned in. He didn't just accept the storm, he became part of it. Their marriage wasn't about balance, it was about combustion. They matched each other's desperation, fed each other's recklessness, and together, they spiraled even faster than they ever had alone. And through it all, one thought kept creeping closer. Elizabeth, the frail woman in the wheelchair, the inheritance tied up in trusts, the fortune sitting just out of reach. For Marjorie and Roger, Elizabeth wasn't just family, she was the prize. The night of June 26, 1977, began like any other inside Glensheen. Elizabeth's nurses followed their usual routine: medications, a bit of light conversation, tucking her in upstairs. The house was massive, but at the end of the night, it felt small and hushed. The lake outside groaned with waves against the rocky shore, the kind of sound that lulled the mansion to sleep. One of Elizabeth's night nurses, Velma Pietla, settled into her shift. Velma was in her 50s, kind, dependable, the type of woman families trusted with their most vulnerable loved ones. For her, nights at Glensheen were quiet. The air was heavy with the smell of old wood and polish, the stillness broken only by the creak of the mansion settling into itself. Sometime after midnight, the silence broke. The intruder had slipped in through a back door. They weren't here to steal heirlooms or to admire the mansion's grandeur. They were here for something, someone specific. Velma was the first they encountered. She was attacked quickly, brutally, bludgeoned with a brass candlestick. The blow ended her life before she could reach the telephone, before she could even cry out loud enough to wake the rest of the house. Her body was left on the floor near the stairwell, a warning of what was to come. Upstairs, Elizabeth remained in bed, unaware. Frail in body, but still sharp of mind, she had trusted her nurses to keep her safe. The intruder moved silently through the halls, the old mansion swallowing their footsteps. When they reached Elizabeth's room, she had no way to fight back, no chance to run. She was smothered with her own satin pillow. It was quiet, efficient, and cruel. By the time dawn broke over Lake Superior, Elizabeth Congdon, the last surviving child of Chester Congdon, the keeper of his legacy, was dead. So was her nurse. Two women killed inside one of Minnesota's grandest homes. Glensheen was no longer a monument to wealth and legacy. It was a crime scene. Morning came to Glensheen like it always did. The sun climbing over Lake Superior, light spilling across the water, the waves slapping against the rocks below the mansion's cliffside. For the staff, it should have been another routine day of tending to Elizabeth, preparing meals, and keeping the estate in order. But the first signs that something was wrong appeared almost immediately. Day nurse Mildred Garview arrived. She stepped into the grand foyer like she always did, the cool air of the lake drifting through the house. But that morning, something felt different. As she climbed the mansion's sweeping staircase, she saw Velma slumped against the window seat. For a split second, Mildred might have thought her friend had fainted. But then she saw the blood. Velma's head had been struck again and again with a brass candlestick, her wrist half bound with a nylon stocking that hadn't held. Panic rising, Mildred rushed upstairs to Elizabeth's room. The heiress lay still in her bed, her face covered by a satin pillow. There were no signs of a struggle. She had been smothered in her sleep. The mansion, with its carved wood, stained glass, and elegant silence, had become a tomb. Shock ripped through the staff, calls were made to the police, and soon the mansion was swarming with investigators. Glensheen, once a quiet Duluth landmark, was now the site of one of Minnesota's most infamous crime scenes. News of Elizabeth's death spread quickly. She wasn't just a wealthy old woman in a mansion. She was a Congdon, the last one. Her death wasn't only a tragedy, it was a scandal, and almost immediately whispers began. Who could possibly want Elizabeth dead? And why would anyone kill a frail, wheelchair-bound woman and the nurse who cared for her? When Duluth police arrived at Glensheen that morning, the mansion felt like something out of a nightmare. The investigation at Glensheen unfolded like a trail of whispers, little details that, when strung together, painted a picture far darker than anyone wanted to believe. Police quickly realized this wasn't random. Whoever had moved through the mansion that night had done it with eerie calm. A bathroom sink was still damp, as if the killer had washed their hands before leaving. Jewelry boxes were emptied, drawers pulled open, a wicker suitcase gone. Down in the basement, a window had been smashed, glass scattered inward. At first glance, it looked like a break-in, but investigators would later decide it was theater, a distraction. The real way in was probably much simpler. A key, or just someone who knew Glensheen well enough to slip inside unnoticed. Then came the escape. The killer didn't run, they didn't hide in the woods. Instead, they slid behind the wheel of Velma Pietla's car and drove south, straight to the Minneapolis-St. Paul airport. At 6:35 a.m., a parking stub was time-stamped at the short-term lot. The car was abandoned there, Velma's keys tossed carelessly into a trash can. It was bold, almost casual, as if the killer already believed they'd gotten away with it. Inside the airport, another clue. At a small gift shop, a man bought a suede garment bag with 3 $20 bills. Witnesses later remembered him juggling a wicker case as he paid. 2 days after the murders, the Duluth Radisson forwarded an envelope to the Caldwell's Hotel in Colorado. Inside was a Byzantine coin, one of the exact pieces missing from Elizabeth's jewelry case. The envelope was postmarked June 27th, the very day of the killings. It was addressed in Roger's handwriting. And when investigators searched the Caldwell's hotel room, the picture grew sharper. There was a wicker case, a suede garment bag, and a box of jewelry that included Elizabeth's own watch and ring. But the final nail wasn't found in luggage. It was in a bank. A notarized letter signed by Marjorie just 3 days before the murders, granting Roger millions from her inheritance upon Elizabeth's death. Prosecutors would later call it the murder contract. Roger Caldwell's trial was the kind that turned Duluth into a stage. The press packed the gallery, reporters scribbling every detail. For the community, it wasn't just about a man on trial. It was about Glensheen, about the Kong Dong legacy, about whether the justice system could untangle a crime this brazen. Roger sat at the defense table looking more like a businessman than a killer. Clean-cut suits, neatly combed hair. He didn't fit the image of a man who had bludgeoned a nurse and smothered an elderly woman. That became part of the tension in the courtroom, this clash between appearance and accusation. As the state laid out its case, Roger's demeanor shifted. Sometimes he looked forward, staring at the floor as witnesses testified. Other times he leaned forward, jaw tight, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. When prosecutors held up the so-called murder contract, he broke into nervous laughter, a reaction that landed poorly with the jury. Witnesses were called: airport employees who remembered the man with the wicker case, handwriting experts who compared the envelope, investigators who walked the jury through Glensheen's blood-stained halls. Each detail built pressure. By the time the jewelry was displayed in evidence bags, you could feel the weight in the room. Roger's defense tried to punch holes, argued the evidence was circumstantial, that the fingerprint on the coin envelope was shaky science, that he was being railroaded because he was married to Marjorie. But Roger himself didn't help. At times, he seemed arrogant, smirking as prosecutors spoke. Other times, he sat slouched and expressionless, as if he'd already resigned himself to the outcome. The jury deliberated for only a few hours. When they filed back in, the room held its breath. Guilty. 2 counts of first-degree murder. Roger blinked hard, but didn't break. No tears, no outburst, just a tight-lipped stare straight ahead as if he didn't hear the words. But outside the courthouse, people cheered. To them, the conviction was justice for Elizabeth, justice for Velma. Still, even in victory, prosecutors knew there was a hole in the story. Roger had been convicted, but the woman many believed that had orchestrated it all, Marjorie, was still waiting for her day in court. If Roger's trial was about evidence, Marjorie's was about perception. She walked into court in 1979, not as a murderer, but as the grieving daughter accused of something harder to prove: conspiracy. The prosecution's argument was clear. Roger might have swung the candlestick and pressed the pillow, but Marjorie had set the stage. She was the one drowning in debt, the one signing the murder contract days before her mother's death, the one who had the most to gain from Elizabeth's fortune. But Marjorie was skilled at something evidence couldn't touch. She knew how to perform. On the stand, she was calm, poised, even sympathetic. She spoke of her mother with affection, playing the role of the dutiful daughter. She admitted to financial troubles, but painted herself as misunderstood, the victim of circumstance. She deflected suspicion onto Roger without ever saying it outright, letting the jury imagine that maybe he had acted alone. The prosecution laid out their case: the notarized document, the timing of Roger's trip, the motive of desperation. But unlike Roger, there was nothing physical that put Marjorie inside Glensheen that night. No fingerprints, no receipts, no direct trail from her hand to the murders. And in the end, that was enough. The jury found her not guilty. The verdict stunned Duluth. Many couldn't believe Marjorie had walked free. Rumors swirled. The press feasted on her image, this elegant, smiling woman who had just slipped through the justice system. Was she innocent or simply untouchable? What no one knew then was that Marjorie's story was far from over. Acquittal didn't cleanse her reputation. It followed her like a ghost. The trial had made her infamous. In Duluth and far beyond, she became the woman many believed had orchestrated her mother's death and walked away smiling. The jury said not guilty, but the public wasn't convinced, and that shadow followed her everywhere she went. What came next only made the whispers louder. In the years after Glensheen, Marjorie's life unraveled in ways that seemed almost cursed. Homes she owned mysteriously caught on fire, not once, but multiple times. Investigators raised eyebrows, insurers grew suspicious, but somehow she always seemed to slip just out of reach. She remarried more than once, and husbands who came into her orbit didn't always survive it. Roger Caldwell himself, years after his release, would spiral into despair and die by suicide. A final, tragic footnote to the saga. And Marjorie, she carried on. Arrests, fraud charges, prison time. Her name became tied to scandal after scandal, from Minnesota to Arizona to California. Wherever she went, trouble followed, but no matter how far she traveled, one place clung to her story like a ghost. Glensheen. Today, Glensheen is a museum. Each year, thousands of visitors wander its halls, marveling at the carved woodwork, the gleaming antiques, and the sweeping views of Lake Superior. But nearly all of them slow at one particular place, the staircase landing where Velma Pietla lost her life. The guides don't shy away from the story. They acknowledge the murders, careful but unflinching. Still, for many visitors, acknowledgement isn't enough. Some say the house feels heavier there, that the air seems to press in, that the silence in Elizabeth's bedroom just hangs a beat too long. For Minnesotans, Glensheen is more than just a historic mansion. It is a monument to wealth, shadowed by betrayal. A place where privilege could not shield a family from violence, and where, even now, justice feels like an unfinished story.